This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Tim Ludford is an independent development and humanitarian aid professional. His work has spanned the globe in Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Prior to going solo, Tim worked for International Solutions Group and the Japan International Cooperation Agency. Tim holds master's degrees from the University of London and the University of Edinburgh. I connected with Tim for this interview in London. Tim, thank you so much for being on the show today. We really appreciate your time. Let's start out with, give us a little bit of background about how you chose to become a development or aid professional. Like, was this something that you always wanted to do? Was this a specific career path, or did you fall into it? How did you get to where you are?
Destiny, Stephen. Destiny. I don't know, really. It was partly falling into something, and partly it fulfills many things that probably had been my interests or things that I had been looking to have some kind of professional involvement in, but hadn't necessarily ever kind of that hadn't come together as a coherent picture, with a big flashing light saying, development or humanitarian.
So when you went to university, it wasn't like, I'm going to get this degree so that I can go get a job with the UN or whatever.
Goodness knows why I went to university, but I did. And at the end of it, I had no idea what I was going to do. So afterwards, I did, I think, a not untypical kind of studenty type thing where you're like, oh, well, I'm going to, I'll do something, do something worthwhile. But I meant simply as a, volunteering type thing, in some kind of international context. That's what I had in my head and was sort of mulling over and looking for. And then I basically stumbled across, or almost it stumbled across me, a sort of, I think a Peace Corps equivalent thing. In the UK, we have something called VSO, Voluntary Service Overseas, which do something similar to Peace Corps, but a bit less dramatic. At least the thing that I did was 6 months rather than, the 1 or 2 years or whatever Peace Corps is. Mm-hmm. So I stumbled across this thing. They said, can you leave in 2 days? And I said yes.
Where was the VSO located?
Nigeria, Jos, Nigeria. Basically, what we were doing was it was a small group of people that they got together, half of which were Nigerian and half of which were British, all under the age of, I think it was under the age of 25, between 18 and 25. And so we spent a period of time in Nigeria and a period of time, I can't remember if it was before or afterwards, I think afterwards, in Birmingham in the UK, doing, it was very unscripted, but let's say doing useful things of a vaguely social nature, right? Mm-hmm. So there was a general theme, I think, of HIV and AIDS, but it wasn't very prescriptive. So just kind of a lot of, I don't know, when we were in Jos, we made contact with once we were there, loads of different organizations saying what they're doing, saying, look, we're 14 people with a, few ideas and, 14 pairs of hands and legs and, whatever other limbs were required. And what can we do? What do you think those people could be doing? Could you use us? Would you, is there something that you've been wanting to do that could use an extra little push, et cetera, et cetera?
And were you able to make that, so you said it was sort of, you trusted in the process. Was that because VOS was a known entity and you sort of said, how bad can it be?
Yeah, VSO actually.
Sorry, VSO.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also just being 21 or 22 or whatever I was and just... the
world is your oyster kind of thing. I mean, you could...
What's the worst that could happen, Yeah. Potentially lots of terrible things. But I mean, VSO were a reasonably, it wasn't like some random organization with a website who I saw online. It was a VSO or established NGO kind of the stature to Peace Corps in the States. A lot of kind of people do it, and they're well known for doing a similar 2-year program for people in the later part of their careers to share skills in the community, et cetera, et cetera. So they were, there was a certain amount of trust for that and then just a certain amount of, youthful stupidity maybe.
So what was the, you got back after this 6-month leap of faith, you sort of were smitten. What was the next step? Where did you take your career?
I entered the heady world of mobile phone sales. It was day after day, an unending joy. But it was when I came back. I mean, I guess it planted a seed, and I sort of realized, and it was something that I had never considered before, that there were a bunch of people who actually are paid to do things not entirely dissimilar, to the things that I've just done for 6 months, and that's what they do. That's their job. In politics, I thought maybe in one day I'd end up going into politics in some way, shape, or form. I was interested in, my degree was in economics and politics. I was interested in those kind of, I was always kind of vaguely engaged by these kind of ideas, and had a vague sense of like maybe I was looking for something like something of a vocation or whatever. And then it sort of, I was like increasingly kind of solidified around that experience that I'd had. Could be something, okay, maybe I. And then I did a bit of research, and bottom line was, in whatever, this day and age anyway, if you want to go do this and get paid, the easiest way, step one, go get a master's. So that's what I ended up doing. So I turned the world of mobile sales to my advantage, and when I'd saved up enough, I enrolled in a master's.
And then were you able to get a job right out of your master's degree?
Like, I remember, I think I was unemployed for about 3 weeks or something like that.
No, that's ridiculous. That's fantastic.
Yeah. I came out and I sent off a few applications. I guess I applied smart, I guess. I sent out a few applications, and I got a couple of interviews. I think I got one with DFID in the UK, and I got one with JICA, who are the Japanese version of DFID or USAID or whatever. Also in the UK, I'd never thought of such a thing, but they had a small UK presence, who ran a few of their warehouses that they have scattered around the globe with humanitarian supplies in, and then did other tasks as and when required. And I got offered the JICA job, and so I just took it. Yeah, it was a great first job. They were like, here's a very rough idea of what we think you should do, but now, go and make your own job description and, tell me why it'd be useful.
That's fantastic. That's like ideal.
It was.
Especially from a donor perspective, simply because usually they're highly structured. And I would think the Japanese would be that's the epitome of structure, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's completely true. And I think it was the fact that this office sort of didn't really have the original purpose of this office was very simple. It was that once upon a time they restructured their humanitarian operations, JICA, who run Japan's humanitarian operations, and they decided that the smartest thing to do was to keep supplies in warehouses, because they fly their supplies through commercial airliners. They don't sort of involve the military or anything like that. So they scattered a few warehouses across the globe, and put one person basically in charge of that, of looking after it, who had to be kind of on the ground-ish. Mm-hmm. But then putting one person on the ground is the marginal cost of putting a second person on the ground becomes is actually not that much, because if one person still needs it was still a JICA staff member, so they, got all the benefits of being a JICA staff member abroad, which meant they had to invest in a housing for them and all these other things. So then then it made sense, well, we might as well I think they thought, well, we should use this for more than just a guy looking after a warehouse and doing all the administration for that. And then it grew slightly in responsibilities, in which basically the office had become slightly entrepreneurial, in that it was like, how can we be useful? And there's a typical kind of bureaucratic, how do we continue to justify our existence here? Right.
Was that entrepreneurialism driven? Give us a sense of the makeup of the office. Was it Japanese international staff, or was it all British staff? Or
when I joined, I was the third staff member in this office, which was essentially a room in an office building in West London, and the main guy, the kind of who was JICA, he was the JICA guy, was a long time JICA staff member, sort of, let's say mid of his mid-career. So he was the kind of the JICA bureaucrat, and then he had a Japanese local is kind of their structure was you had the main JICA staff, and then you could have locally hired, like most organisations. They have their international staff and their locally hired staff. So, and the locally hired staff are obviously generally not paid as well and whatever. So and hired on different terms. So there was a Japanese girl who had been hired in London, who'd been studying here and had done a bunch of education here, and then got hired at that. But she was from Tokyo. She'd grown up in Tokyo. And then me, a random English guy. Perhaps because they had a third computer.
I'm going to assume that's not the case. Let me fast forward for a little bit. I mean, you've had what I would consider a pretty nice run thus far, getting to where you are now. You've done considerable amount of time in the Middle East, specifically Iraq. You've done a bunch of work in Africa. Tell me how your specialties have evolved from that first gig. Have you started to hone in on something, or hone in on a particular specialty that you love or that you're passionate about? Are you still sort of, do you keep several hats on? Where are you taking yourself right now?
I mean, I guess to an extent, there's been a little bit of honing, but I think that I've just I've always sort of ridden this slightly strange wave of being a generalist who's sort of working it out as they go along in a series of positions where I'm trying to be as useful as possible, kind of thing, without it having a particular thematic focus or whatever. So, I mean, that was the case at JICA. Then when later I went to Iraq, I did a number of different things. I started closing out a program, but then when that program did close out, there was a bit of having to work out how to, if my position continued to make sense, and to try and find ways of funding myself, essentially. Get out there and find write proposals and all that kind of thing. So in a sense, it was a sudden kind of transition into almost being it was almost like being a consultant from that day on, because it was very much not quite day to day, but competing for a series of bits of work, and if there weren't going to be those, there wasn't going to be continued work for me. And then so that meant, I guess, kind of putting on a cap of the cap of a generalist, right? I am whatever I'm required to be, and that quickly became an evaluator. A bit of training as well, but a lot of evaluation, because there's work like that out there, and secondly because it's a skill set that you can have and apply, in theory anyway, without necessarily being a thematic expert. Although you can make an argument about whether the degree to which thematic expertise is important or not. But
so would your perfect gig right now be, running an evaluation or acting as one of the experts on an evaluation?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know what my perfect gig would be. I go back and forth. Depends on the day, right? There are advantages to being an external evaluator, a consultant, and there are advantages to being anything else. So if it's been a good day or series of weeks and working on something interesting with interesting people, and everything, all the pieces of the puzzle are come together, then ask me on that day, and absolutely, I think being part of a large evaluation or some kind of review, strategic review over a medium term, a number of months, something like that is the kind of thing that I get very motivated by, more so than say 10 days, 2 weeks writing an evaluation of
Sure.
or program where there's never enough time, and
So you're saying you like to see the longer arc of a...
Absolutely. And to be able to kind of really engage with an organization, its culture, the people, a particular area of focus. And then also within that, usually there's a sense of what your work is contributing towards and the direction of change that's going to happen afterwards. And you have an ability to shape that yourself.
Have you ever had the luck of being on sort of a real-time evaluation or an extended evaluation of that type where you really felt like you became a part of the project, or you really were able to see change being affected?
I've had the privilege of being on a couple of I wouldn't call them necessarily. I'm not sure if I call them evaluations, but the terms aren't important. But like strategic reviews, that's called, of elements of different organisations' work. I was with UNICEF recently, and then Plan International. The specific way you phrase it, of course, sometimes you're, as I said earlier, it depends where in what particular day you ask any person about a particular thing they're working on. There were times where it definitely felt, this is great, really engaged with an organisation, and we're helping to engineer change within that organisation. Then there are other days where you're a bit like, the lot of an external consultant is always to sort of bang your head against a wall, and it's hard to imagine much change coming from it, because it's all out of your control ultimately, and you have to make your peace with that.
And so, how are you right now? How do you manage your time between doing work and looking for new work? I guess that's probably one of the biggest challenges as an independent professional, is that you sort of always have to be out there hunting while at the same time performing work. How have you balanced that?
I don't think I'm a fantastic model professional. I don't I don't have a great Excel sheet and a series and a process and everything. I've just been very fortunate in that to have been able to generate work from a network of people that I have come to know over a period of time. That doesn't mean that I'm never writing, involved in proposal writing processes or anything like that. Of course you are, but I've never found myself having to have a process particularly. I've been, I can't really explain why it is, I guess.
So what you're telling me is that your process is to make sure that you maintain and massage your network, and that universe of, whatever that universe is, that network, opportunities arrive, and you're able, sometimes they're good for you and sometimes they're not. I think
that's, the lifeblood of particularly an individual consultant is your network. And it's not particularly less true even with the way that, let's say, full-time posts get handed out. I wouldn't hazard a guess on the percentages, but I'd say more than half of full-time posts involve in some way, someone saying, oh, I know a person who would be great for this, or, et cetera, or sending it out, someone who already works for an organization sending a thing out among their friends and network. And it's not particularly different in my experience, in the way that a lot of consultancies, not the huge, ones that involve multiple people and so on, but a lot of consultancies are generated simply through, people need someone to do something at a certain time, and they think about who they know who could do that.
As an independent consultant, you're often hired to review projects or provide technical assistance in some fashion. That could be as an evaluator, it could be as a capacity builder, or, you're lucky enough to continue to wear the generalist hat. And so there could be a number of things for you. But ultimately, your end goal is to affect change somehow.
Sure.
Do you find that you've been successful in that? Are usually organizations and teams receptive to that and then actually make change, or is it has that not been the case?
I think it's a continual dance of sorts across the period of time of which you're involved in an organization. Every organization thinks that they're open to change. Every individual thinks they're open to change. And in a lot of ways they are open to change. And in a lot of ways, they might find that they naturally resist change, where they probably have a picture of what that change might be, or what it might mean. And then as soon as the whole point of bringing in an external person is that it creates a risk, or even just it creates the possibility that the change will not be exactly what different people in the organization thought, and maybe not everyone always thinks the same thing. So my point is, you can't describe it as a binary, but you're constantly wrestling with these kinds of dynamics, and people wanting the assignment to mean certain things, or the kind of change you're trying to affect, or have, they are thinking 3 moves ahead for them or their project or their department or whatever about how this will affect them. You might have made a bunch of fantastic recommendations, and you might have worked with the organization long enough to even affect a number of changes directly. But will they be sustained? Will they disappear within 12 months when you're not there, or when, someone else comes in and decides, a new manager comes in and decides to completely reorganize things and all this? I think you have to make the piece as a external consultant that, you have a short period of time in which you can do your best, and then you have to walk away and it's on your backs now. I've done what I can for you. And in some, you will never even get the possibility of knowing, right? If you've done a week or 2 week or 3 week evaluation, you've written a report, it's gone to some people, they've suggested some revisions, you've sent a second draft, and that's it. That's the contract fulfilled. That's the agreement.
Sure, and then you rarely get to take it to the next step of change implementer.
You have no idea what's going to happen to that report. It could, in some cases, you have a strong sense that it's, it was a box ticking exercise, that it's, people felt they had to commission an evaluation because it looks good, and, exactly how much of a meaningful process of learning is going to take place in and around your report. It's probably not much is going to happen. Maybe 2 or 3 people are going to read it, and that's it. And then it's going to be left on someone's hard drive until they break their computer.
So often we hear from people, you've heard this probably 1,000 times, that there's just too much to do. There's not enough hours in the day. And so when you come and you try to affect change, you're trying to put yet another task on their desk. Do you think that's a key reason?
I think that's an important reason. I wouldn't describe it as the most important reason, though. I mean, definitely, it's a lot of people are, working at maximum capacity already, to the point where, they can't do everything they would like to do. But then it becomes about the importance that is attached to learning and change, and the process and the processes through which you can do that within an organization. And I think that there's still a lot of space for an evolution within the development humanitarian industry in the way that organizations learn and change. I don't think the systems have been thought through consistently enough as far as they exist anyway.
Can you give me a concrete example of that from either one of your gigs or from a specific organization you've worked with? Where is there a way to move the needle that you would love to see?
Well, I mean, I'd rather talk to some extent in generalizations, but I can be more specific in that. Let's take a classic feature of the development industry. You have people who will work on average in a post for 12 to 24 months, but that's more or less every single post. So therefore, across a 3-year period of time in which there is, say, a project or program, you have sort of potentially 3 cycles of people fulfilling that work, or 2 people, say, one person did 2 years, one person did a year. And if you aggregate that continual and perpetual change just simply at the individual level, it's very difficult to retain information. It's very difficult to pass on learning, like just kind of in an ad hoc way, because the people are changing too often. Therefore, it's a requirement that you have I would imagine the word sophisticated is probably fair, that sophisticated systems of learning and reflection. Evaluations are sort of thought to be ipso facto the same thing as a process of reflection and learning, right? So we commissioned an evaluation, and a few people have read it, and we probably, we discussed it. So it's almost like learning and change has been reduced to the currency of the evaluation, whereas an evaluation is really just just a tool, and a tool which should be part of a wider process of reflection within an organisation. Like, you do not see organisations sit around and discuss multiple evaluations periodically across the year, maybe once a year, maybe quarterly, or whatever, and say, look, okay, what information do we have? What does it tell us about our organisation? What does it tell us about the jobs that we are doing? That process almost never exists. So I can't give one example of a time where a basic process like that would sound satisfactory exists within an organisation. Now, part of that is because people are incredibly busy, but then it's about how you prioritise that process versus other tasks that you have to have. You know, if you look at the amount of time people spend writing quarterly reports or whatever, it's a huge chunk of people's time. I mean, but that is absolutely required by a project for its money, and if you didn't do it, the donor would be on your back, and you would cease to. You would probably not get the next tranche of money released, and so everyone does it. Everyone makes the time. Is my point. I don't see the same prioritization of learning and reflection within any organisation.
Yeah. So clearly, when there's a task that's tied to the donor dollar, it happens. It has to happen, and when it
has to happen, the incentive structure is there, and there is no clear incentive structure for the kind of process I'm talking about. I mean, there is an incentive in the sense of, I suppose if you put that to most people, they would say, okay, I could see value in that. And so therefore there would be an incentive in the fact that we might think it would improve our work.
How much, in your estimation, pain or discomfort was caused by the UK's push under Cameron, right, to do value for money?
In my experience, I think that it is having an impact, quite a strong impact on organisations, and I think that DFID are ahead of nearly every other organisation on asking or demanding. Actually, it's more framed as a demand that organisations are able to speak intelligently about the work that they do and justify why they did it the way they did and how they spent the money and all these kind of things. I mean, it's in no way going to be perfect, because you continually read, from DFID, more work needs to be done on this. We still need.
It's a never-ending process, yeah.
But I don't think that DFID on their own can transform the culture of development. Even if they knew how. I mean, even if we knew how to, what excellent process of learning change would look like off the top of our heads.
Well, let me say this. You've been very generous with your time. I've got two more questions. First, you've worked around the world. You've traveled around the world. Everyone's got stories, right, in this business. What's the story that you tell, either, an old friend or someone you've just recently met? Like, what's your best story that's either on the tip of your tongue or something that you love to tell people about that crazy time or some inspiring event in the work that you've done?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. I am trying to remain employable. What should I think of an answer? I don't think I have one. I don't think I have a classic zinger of a story that
is appropriate for all audiences.
It's appropriate for an audience. It's also going to make me sound, both widely experienced and just a little bit profound. Which is kind of what I go for. Do you know what I mean? Instead of
how about a worse story? Do you have like a everything went pear-shaped story? Or the thing is, I don't want to make. I mean, it's not really. I mean, things kind of, life is a bit boring, really, isn't it? Things just generally work pretty well. Well, I love how you say that as someone who, lived and worked in Iraq for a couple of years. Because for your average British citizen, that's just not normal. That's not boring by definition.
I acknowledge where you're coming from with that, I suppose. I mean, Iraq was obviously definitely interesting in some ways, but actually when you're in
conflict environment, the life that you live is perhaps surprisingly uncolourful because of the restrictions that it imposes on your life. You can't do all these wild and crazy things. You have a very regimented and structured life and what you can and can't do.
Unpack that for me, because I think that most people not in the development world might find that interesting, that when you're working in a area of crisis, life can get pretty boring because it's super regimented. What does that mean?
Well, it means, to use the example of Iraq, so I was living mainly in the north of Iraq in the Kurdish region, right, which was pretty peaceful. You could pretty much live a fairly normal life. However, you could only live that form of life in that small part of the country, right? So, so that's a sort of geographical restriction, even in an enclave of peace, right? But beyond that, if you went to Baghdad, you basically got in a car, went to, lived in a fortified compound, as in, big guys with big guns, and then you go out only if you need to go out, more or less. Increasingly over the time that became less true, and now people maybe do travel a bit more frivolously. But so the rest of the time, people are stuck in offices or houses, and sometimes the house is the office, and all these kind of dynamics. And it's not that exciting. Exciting day is someone has a birthday, so they go out and get cake and drink 2 bottles of wine. And that leads to the kind of stories that you can't tell on a podcast.
I completely understand.
So it is a lot more banal than you might imagine, but it's not that bad. It's still quite interesting. I know a lot of people, the same people, keep doing those kind of.
Sure, there's got to be people who thrive on it.
And it is kind of fascinating to feel you are at the center of something, that you are somewhere where things matter in a way that they, do not matter day to day in a more stable place. Where to use a slightly strange sounding phrase, but where events are taking place.
Sure.
Where you can
history is being made. It's being reported on the news.
And you can engage with that, and in your own little way, you might try some little to chip away and edge it in a slightly more progressive direction than it might otherwise have gone. Although there's that's you're very very powerless in the face of the dynamics and trends that actually make things happen there. But you're there and you're trying to do something. So that's what you get out of it. You don't actually really get out of it too many, great stories to share around the dinner table. And that can be it's an odd thing when you're, because you're often asked that, people are like, oh, tell me about, that sounds really interesting. You're out to dinner with some people, and, tell me about it, tell me something funny.
Yeah. What's it like to live in a war zone kind of questions?
And you just don't have good answers to that question, because there isn't a colourful way of describing it. It is very banal, and people get a bit disappointed with you.
You've talked about the network as being essential to your success as an independent professional in this business. Is there any other sage advice you'd give to someone who's interested in sort of making the jump to go solo, or even somebody who's maybe completing a master's degree and thinking about, this is the career I need or the career I want? Is there any other sage advice that you'd say you must do this or really pay attention to that?
Well, I do like the idea of being a sage, but let me have I think that with consulting, I think it's just a case of, if you get an opportunity to do one thing, you're probably going to get an opportunity to do a second thing, and there probably will be a third thing. It may not be immediate and it may not be perfect, but it's like anything. If you get the opportunity to have your first job in development, there's probably going to be a second job. probably.
And do the best job you can, and so that the second job appears.
But generally speaking, I would say I don't know if I really have any meaningful advice. I mean, I'm not. I don't know why you're investing me with this power, but just work leads to work in development as in anything else. So if you're doing a master's, get experience, any kind of experience that will leverage you into a first job, and then a second job, and then so on and so forth. Broadly speaking, the same with consultancy. Just get the first one. You'd be surprised if you emailed everybody that you know that works. If let's say you're already in development, if you emailed everyone that you know that's currently working development and said, "Have you got any consultancy work doing?" Someone has something that they need someone for quite quickly. That's almost true 100% of the time. There's just so many people that need people, and they don't have the time to spend ages looking for them, and it's a bit of a crapshoot sending out, posting an opportunity and seeing who comes to you. You'll be surprised by how how much you're helping people by saying, "Look, I'm looking for opportunities. Is there things that I can do there for you?" This is, if you have a particular specialism, all the better. Although that tends to narrow down in a weird way often what opportunities you do have.
Mr. Ludford, thank you so much for your time today.
Mr. Laddick, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
You've been listening to Terms of Reference, a weekly podcast from aidpreneur.com. Find us on iTunes or at www.aidpreneur.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.